In the remote Cascade Mountains, a lone hiker sought solitude among towering pines and mist-laden valleys. Ethan Vance was about to escape into the wilderness, but the storm had other plans. A routine 3-day trek turned treacherous when an unexpected blizzard swallowed the trails, cutting off all roads to safety. Ethan wasn't just another stranded adventurer. For 5 years, he had been a search and rescue specialist, known for navigating impossible conditions and bringing the lost back home. But after one devastating failure, the Anderson case, he abandoned his post, convinced that some people were meant to stay lost. When the storm turned deadly, Ethan sought refuge in an abandoned ranger outpost, unaware that something else was already inside. The whispers in the wind weren't just tricks of the storm, and the footprints in the snow didn't belong to him. As the past clawed its way into the present, Ethan realized he wasn't lost in the mountains. The mountains had been waiting for him. What began as a fight for survival would become a descent into something far darker. The Cascade Wilderness would never be the same after Ethan Vance uncovered what lay hidden beyond the storm. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weight of Ethan Vance's backpack settled against his shoulders, like an old friend as he adjusted the straps one final time. Early morning mist clung to the pines of the Cascade Mountains, transforming the landscape into something primeval. This was where he belonged, not in the suffocating embrace of civilization with its pitying glances and careful conversations. Perfect conditions, he muttered to himself, checking his topographical map despite having memorized the route days. Go. Old habits. The kind that kept people alive in places like this. 3 days of solitude stretched before him. 3 days of nothing but the sound of his boots against earth, the bite of mountain air in his lungs, and blessed silence. He told no one where exactly he was heading, just a vague mention to the ranger at the station about exploring the northern ridge. The less specific, the better. People had a way of following, of checking in, of intruding. Ethan ran his thumb over the worn search and rescue patch he still kept in his pocket, a reminder of who he'd been before. 5 years since he'd resigned. 5 years since the Anderson case, since he'd failed to bring 8-year-old Tyler back alive. A jay's harsh call pulled him from the memory. He'd learned to recognize the warning signs of his mind wandering down those particular paths. Better to focus on the present, on the feel of pine needles beneath his boots, on the methodical rhythm of his hiking poles striking stone. By midday, he'd made good progress, covering nearly 12 miles of increasingly remote terrain. The trail had disappeared several miles back, leaving nothing but game paths and his own instinct for navigation. Just the way he liked it. He paused at a ridge overlooking a steep valley, uncapping his water bottle and taking a measured sip. Something felt off. The forest had gone silent. No birdsong, no rustling of small creatures. Just the distant sigh of wind through the treetops. Ethan's gaze swept the tree line, muscles tensing with an instinct honed by years of wilderness experience. There, a flicker of movement at the edge of his peripheral vision. He turned quickly, but whatever it was had vanished. Probably a deer, he said aloud, though he didn't believe it. Deer didn't silence an entire forest. The radio at his hip crackled to life, startling him. Repeat. Severe weather system, moving in from the northwest. All hikers in the Castle Peak and North Ridge areas advised to seek immediate shelter. Storm expected to... The transmission dissolved into static, then silence. Ethan frowned, checking his weather app. No signal. He pulled out his backup satellite device. Nothing there either. He scanned the horizon. The sky to the west had darkened, but nothing that suggested the urgent warning he'd just heard. Still, weather in the mountains was notoriously unpredictable. Better safe than stupid. Ethan adjusted his route, angling southeast toward lower elevation. The oppressive silence of the forest followed him. Twice more he caught glimpses of something moving just beyond clear sight. A shadow between trees, the subtle shift of a branch when there was no wind. By late afternoon, the storm announced itself with a violence that took even Ethan by surprise. The temperature plummeted as wind whipped through the trees with enough force to bend trunks. Lightning split the sky, followed by thunder that he felt in his chest more than heard. The first drops of rain hit like bullets. Within minutes he was drenched, the trail beneath his feet transforming into slick mud. Visibility dropped to mere yards as sheets of rain obscured the landscape. "Damn it," Ethan growled, fighting to maintain his footing on the increasingly treacherous slope. This wasn't just bad weather, this was dangerous. He needed shelter, and fast. The downpour intensified, becoming a solid wall of water. Lightning illuminated the forest in brief, stark flashes that played tricks on his eyes. In one such flash, Ethan could have sworn he saw a figure standing among the trees, perfectly still amid the chaos of the storm. When the next bolt came, there was nothing there. His boots slipped on the saturated ground, sending him sliding several feet down the embankment. He caught himself against a tree, the rough bark tearing into his palm. Another flash of lightning revealed a structure through the trees, some kind of cabin or outpost barely visible through the curtain of rain. Ethan oriented himself toward it, moving as quickly as safety allowed. The building materialized out of the storm, an old ranger outpost, its weathered timbers gray with age and neglect. The Forest Service logo was still barely visible on the faded sign, half hidden by overgrown brush. Ethan tried the door. Locked. Of course. He fumbled in his pack for his multi-tool, working the simple lock with practiced movements until it gave way with a reluctant click. The door swung inward, with a low groan. Ethan stumbled inside, dripping water onto the dusty wooden floor. He swept his flashlight around the interior, a single room with boarded windows, a small wood stove in the corner, and various shelves lined with forgotten supplies. "Hello?" he called out of habit, though he expected no answer. The outpost had clearly been abandoned for years. He shrugged off his soaked backpack, methodically setting up a temporary camp. The wood stove still worked, and there was dry kindling stacked beside it. Soon a small fire cast jumping shadows across the walls. As Ethan hung his wet clothes to dry, he noticed footprints in the dust. Not the clear impressions of recent visitors, but subtle disturbances in the thick layer covering the floor. Someone had been here, and not too long ago. The storm raged outside, rain lashing against the walls and roof with unrelenting fury. Ethan told himself that the outpost was simply a convenient shelter, that others had likely taken refuge here before him. But as he settled into his sleeping bag, staring at the dancing shadows on the ceiling, an unsettling feeling took root in his chest. The wind howled, a sound almost like words if you listened too closely. The outpost creaked and settled around him, but it was the silence beneath those sounds that bothered him most, a watchful, waiting silence that seemed to press against his ears. Ethan closed his eyes, gripping his knife beneath his sleeping bag. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, something else entirely seemed to be brewing. "Just the storm," he whispered to himself. "Nothing but the storm." But even as exhaustion pulled him toward sleep, he couldn't shake the sensation of eyes upon him, patient and hungry in the darkness beyond the firelight's reach. Ethan woke with a start, his hand already closed around the knife beneath his sleeping bag. The fire in the wood stove had died to embers, casting the outpost in a dull red glow that did little to push back the darkness. Outside, the storm continued its assault, though the initial fury had settled into a steady pounding rhythm. His watch read 3:17 a.m., the witching hour his old team used to call it, when the lost were most likely to make fatal mistakes, when hope was at its thinnest. Something had woken him, a sound distinct from the storm's chaos. He lay perfectly still, controlling his breathing as he listened. There it was again, a soft scraping against the outpost's exterior wall, too deliberate to be a branch, too rhythmic to be random debris. Ethan rose silently, knife in hand. Years of search and rescue operations had taught him to move without sound, to observe before acting. He pressed his back against the wall beside the single window, carefully peeling back a corner of the makeshift covering to peer outside. Nothing but darkness and the silver sheets of rain. Whatever had made the noise was gone, or hidden from view. "Just the wind," he muttered, but the words rang hollow even to his own ears. With sleep now impossible, Ethan decided to thoroughly inspect his shelter. The outpost was smaller than it had seemed in the chaos of his arrival, perhaps 15 by 20 feet, with a small wood stove, a desk against one wall, and various shelves holding abandoned supplies. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing cobwebs in corners and a thick layer of dust nearly everywhere. Nearly, but not completely. As he scanned the room more carefully, Ethan noticed paths through the dust, places where it had been disturbed recently, not by his own movements but by someone or something else. Near the entrance, he discovered muddy footprints he'd missed in his desperate rush for shelter. They weren't his own. His boots left a distinctive tread pattern he recognized instantly. These prints were different, narrower, and they led both in and out of the outpost as if someone had been here just before the storm hit. "Hello?" Ethan called out, feeling foolish even as he did so. The outpost was too small to hide anyone. Yet the sensation of being watched persisted, prickling at the back of his neck. His flashlight beam fell on the desk, an old, sturdy piece of government furniture built to last decades. Its surface was surprisingly clean compared to the rest of the outpost. Beside it sat a half-burned kerosene lantern, the glass chimney still intact. Ethan frowned. The wick looked fresh, the reservoir still containing fuel. Someone had used this recently. The top drawer of the desk was locked. Ethan worked it open with his multi-tool, revealing a logbook bound in faded green canvas. The embossed Forest Service emblem had nearly worn away, but the words Ranger Station 17, Daily Log remained visible. He carried the book to his sleeping bag, adding wood to the stove before settling in to read by flashlight. The earliest entries dated back nearly 30 years. Routine reports of trail conditions, wildlife sightings, and weather patterns. As he flipped through the pages, a name appeared with increasing frequency: Ranger Carter Whitmore. Ethan traced Whitmore's entries through the seasons, professional at first, then increasingly personal as the isolation of the posting apparently wore on him. About 2/3 through the book, the tone shifted subtly. May 12, 1995. Heard strange noises last night. Probably just wildlife, but something about it felt different, like it was trying to get my attention specifically. May 15th, 1995. Found tracks near the eastern perimeter that I can't identify. Too large for any known predator in the region. Will document if seen again. May 23rd, 1995. The noises are back. Almost like whispers. Weather has been unusually stormy for this time of year. Radio contact spotty at best. The entries continued, growing increasingly erratic as weeks passed. Whitmore described feeling watched, finding his supplies rearranged, hearing what he called the voice in the storm, a sound like someone calling for help, always just beyond reach. June 17th, 1995. I know what the others at headquarters would say if I reported this, that I've been alone too long. That isolation plays tricks on the mind. But I know what I've seen. It knows I'm here. It's watching me, waiting. The final entry chilled Ethan's blood. June 28th, 1995. God help me. I heard the voice again. A child, crying for help. I followed it into the trees. There was something there, watching me from the shadows. Not animal. Not human. When I turned back, I couldn't find my way. The station kept disappearing like it was playing with me. 3 hours in the rain before I found my way back. But I don't think I'm alone anymore. I don't think I ever was. The log ended abruptly. No indication of what happened to Whitmore, no final report. Just an unfinished page, and then nothing. Ethan closed the book, the hairs on his arms standing on end. The parallels to his own experience were unsettling. The sudden storm, the sense of being watched, the unexplained sounds. A loud crack from outside made him jump. Just a branch breaking under the weight of the storm, he told himself. Nothing more. He returned the logbook to the desk, trying to dismiss Whitmore's writings as the paranoid ramblings of an isolated mind. That's when he noticed his backpack. He'd left it neatly propped against the far wall, but now it lay on its side, the main compartment partially unzipped. Ethan approached it cautiously, as if it might somehow bite. The contents had been disturbed, his meticulous packing system disrupted. Worst of all, his emergency rations were missing. All of them. "What the hell?" he whispered, rifling through the remaining contents. Nothing else appeared to be missing, just the food, almost as if tap, tap, tap. Ethan froze. The sound came from inside the wall nearest the desk. 3 distinct taps, then silence. He held his breath, listening. Tap, tap, tap. Again, with the exact same rhythm and spacing. He pressed his ear against the wooden panel. Nothing but silence now. When he pulled back and took 3 steps away, the tapping resumed immediately. 3 taps. A pause. 3 more. "Is someone there?" Ethan called, hating the slight tremor in his voice. The tapping stopped instantly. The silence that followed was somehow worse, expectant, as if something was listening for his next move. Ethan spent the next hour methodically examining every inch of the outpost's interior. He found nothing to explain the tapping, no hidden passages or animal nests. What he did find were more inconsistencies. A rusted tin cup placed upside down beside the wood stove that he hadn't noticed before. A small pile of pine needles in the corner arranged in what looked disturbingly like an arrow pointing toward the door. The storm showed no signs of abating as night fell again. Ethan secured the door with a makeshift lock fashioned from paracord and his climbing carabiners. A childhood fear resurfaced, the need to be entirely covered by his sleeping bag, as if the thin fabric could somehow protect him from whatever lurked in the darkness. He fought against exhaustion, determined to remain alert. But the warmth of the wood stove and the rhythmic pounding of the rain eventually lulled him into a fitful doze. The sound of the door creaking jolted him awake. Ethan's eyes flew open, to see the door slowly swinging inward, the paracord lock hanging uselessly from the handle. Cold air and rain gusted through the widening gap. Beyond it, only impenetrable darkness. He grabbed his knife, scrambling to his feet. "Who's there?" he demanded, voice cutting through the howl of the wind. No answer came. Just the door, moving, as if pushed by an invisible hand. The beam of his flashlight caught nothing but rain and shadow. Ethan approached the doorway cautiously, every nerve screaming danger. The knife felt inadequate in his hand as he peered into the storm-tossed night. For a brief, terrible moment, he thought he saw something standing just beyond the circle of light. A darker shadow within the darkness, vaguely human in shape, but somehow wrong in proportion. Then lightning flashed, illuminating the clearing, before the outpost. Nothing but trees and rain and wind. Heart hammering in his chest, Ethan slammed the door shut and wedged a chair beneath the handle. He backed away slowly, knife gripped so tightly his knuckles whitened. This wasn't his imagination. This wasn't the isolation playing tricks on his mind. Something was out there, something that had been in here with him, going through his things while he slept. Something that had taken his food, that had left signs of its presence. Something that had opened a locked door as easily as if the precautions he'd taken meant nothing at all. Ethan pressed his back against the far wall, knife held ready, ears straining to catch any sound above the storm's fury. The logbook's final entry echoed in his mind, Whitmore's growing panic, his certainty that he wasn't alone. Tap, tap, tap. The sound came again, this time from directly behind him. From the very wall he was leaning against. Ethan sprang away, whirling to face it, knife extended before him. Tap, tap, tap. 3 distinctive taps, like knuckles, against wood. Like someone trying to get his attention, or like someone letting him know they knew exactly where he was. Dawn broke reluctantly over the mountains, a faint gray light seeping through the cracks in the boarded windows. Ethan hadn't slept since the door incident. He sat with his back against the desk, knife in one hand, makeshift club fashioned from a broken chair leg in the other. His eyes burned from exhaustion, but the adrenaline coursing through his system kept him painfully alert. The tapping had continued intermittently throughout the night, moving from wall to wall as if whatever caused it was circling the outpost. Each time Ethan approached the sound, it would cease immediately, only to resume elsewhere minutes later. Morning brought no relief from the storm. If anything, it had intensified, the wind now screaming rather than howling. Rain transformed into hail that machine-gunned the roof with relentless fury. Ethan's training battled against his growing fear. Search and rescue had taught him to think methodically, to break problems down into manageable parts. Someone or something was out there. That meant tracks, signs, evidence. He needed to confirm what he was dealing with. His gaze landed on his backpack again. During his vigilant night, he'd noticed new discrepancies. His satellite phone, previously tucked in the inner pocket, now lay exposed atop his clothes. The battery had been removed. "Enough of this," he muttered, rising stiffly to his feet. He rechecked his supplies, taking inventory of what remained. His water purifier and tablets were intact. Basic first aid kit, untouched. Spare clothing, slightly damp but serviceable. Navigation equipment, compass, maps, GPS unit. The latter was dead, though he was certain he'd charged it fully before the trip. His emergency rations remained missing. Ethan formulated a plan. He would set traps. Nothing lethal, just ways to confirm the presence of whatever was stalking him. Then he would investigate the immediate surroundings of the outpost. If someone was out there, they had to have shelter nearby. No one could survive a storm like this without protection. He worked methodically, using fishing line from his emergency kit to create tripwires near the windows and door. He placed his metal cooking pots in strategic locations where they would clatter if disturbed. Finally, he laid a thin layer of ash from the wood stove across the threshold. Anything entering would leave footprints. The storm offered a brief lull around midday, not enough to risk leaving the mountains entirely, but sufficient to explore the area surrounding the outpost. Ethan donned his rain gear, secured his knife at his hip, and the improvised club through his belt. "I'll be back," he said to the empty room, immediately feeling foolish for speaking aloud. But part of him wanted whatever was watching to know he wasn't cowering anymore. He was fighting back. Outside, the forest dripped and shuddered in the aftermath of the night's battering. The ground had turned to mud, perfect for tracking. Almost immediately, Ethan spotted fresh impressions leading away from the outpost. The same narrow footprints he'd seen inside, now pressed deep into the saturated earth. He followed them carefully, marking his path with bright orange surveyor's tape from his pack. The tracks led in a straight line away from the outpost, through a dense stand of pines and toward a rocky outcropping about a quarter-mile distant. Ethan moved cautiously, all senses hyper-alert. The forest remained unnaturally silent, devoid of the wildlife sounds that should have emerged during the storm's respite. Occasionally, he could swear he heard movement behind him, but each time he turned, he found nothing. The footprints led to the base of the outcropping, then abruptly vanished, not fading gradually as they might on harder ground, but disappearing between one step and the next, as if whoever made them had simply ceased to exist. "Impossible," Ethan whispered, kneeling to examine the final prints. Something glinted among the rocks nearby, a small metal object half buried in mud. Ethan excavated it carefully, a Forest Service badge, tarnished and bent. The name was still legible, Whitmore. A chill that had nothing to do with the damp air crawled up Ethan's spine. The logbook's author had been here, right where these mysterious tracks vanished. Movement caught his eye, a splash of faded orange through the trees. Ethan approached cautiously to find an old trail marker, nearly reclaimed by the forest. Beneath it, a weather-worn sign bore a warning. Danger. Area closed to public unstable ground. Risk of subsidence. The sign had been violently defaced. 3 deep parallel gouges ran diagonally across its face, cutting through the wood like it was paper. Ethan ran his fingers over the marks, too deep and wide for a bear, too precise for random damage. A soft clicking sound emanated from the dense brush to his right. Ethan froze, hand moving to his knife. The clicking stopped, replaced by a rustling that circled around him, always just out of sight. "I know you're there," Ethan called, turning slowly to track the sound. "Show yourself." The forest answered with silence. Complete, absolute silence. Even the dripping of water from the trees had ceased, as if the world itself held its breath. A gust of wind suddenly whipped through the clearing, carrying with it the distant sound of static, like a radio struggling to find a signal. Ethan followed it to a hollow log half hidden beneath ferns. Inside, wrapped in a decaying waterproof bag, he found an ancient emergency radio, the kind rangers carried decades ago. The device crackled to life in his hands, though its batteries should have died years earlier. Through waves of static, a garbled voice fought to be heard. "Repeat, does anyone copy? This is Ranger Witt, lost in Sector 17, something in the woods, help." The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by the monotonous hiss of dead air. Ethan turned the radio over in his hands. The battery compartment was empty. There was no power source at all. Dark clouds rolled in as Ethan stared at the impossible device, the storm regrouping for another assault. He needed to get back to the outpost before the deluge resumed. Following his survey tape markers, he retraced his steps through the increasingly dim forest. The outpost came into view just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. Ethan hurried toward it, relief flooding through him at the sight of shelter. Then he stopped dead, the blood freezing in his veins. The door stood wide open. His traps had been disarmed, the fishing line neatly coiled on the porch, the pots stacked inside one another. The ash he'd spread across the threshold was undisturbed, as if whatever had entered had done so without touching the ground. Ethan approached warily, club raised. The interior of the outpost was darker than it should have been in midday, shadows pooling unnaturally in the corners. His backpack had been emptied, contents arranged in a precise circle in the center of the floor. In the middle of the circle lay Ranger Whitmore's logbook, open to a blank page that Ethan was certain hadn't been there before. The storm broke in earnest, driving Ethan inside despite every instinct screaming for him to run. He had nowhere else to go. The mountains would kill him in this weather if whatever stalked him didn't do it first. He rebuilt the fire with shaking hands, the wood stove's warmth doing nothing to dispel the bone-deep chill that had settled into him. As darkness fell once more, Ethan positioned himself in the corner with the best view of the entire outpost, knife at the ready. Hours passed, marked only by the hammering of rain against the roof and the occasional growl of thunder. Ethan fought against exhaustion, knowing that sleep would leave him vulnerable. But 2 nights without rest had taken their toll. His eyelids grew heavy, his grip on the knife loosening despite his best efforts. He jerked awake to pitch darkness. The fire had died completely. How long had he been asleep? His watch read 2:13 a.m., but that seemed wrong. It had been barely 10 p.m. when he'd last checked. The rain had stopped. In its absence, a heavy silence pressed against the outpost. Ethan fumbled for his flashlight, flicking it on with trembling fingers. The beam illuminated his backpack, mysteriously returned to its original position against the wall. The contents he'd found arranged in a circle were gone. On the desk, the logbook lay closed, though he was certain he'd left it on the floor. "I'm losing my mind," he whispered. "Ethan." The sound was so faint he almost missed it. His name carried on a wisp of air that slithered through the cracks in the outpost walls. Ethan spun, flashlight beam slashing through the darkness. "Ethan, help me." A child's voice, soft, frightened, achingly familiar. "Tyler?" Ethan gasped, the name escaping before he could stop it. Tyler Anderson, the 8-year-old he'd failed to find in time. The boy whose death had ended his rescue career. "I'm lost, Ethan. I'm cold." The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, floating on the air like a half-remembered dream. Ethan pressed his hands against his ears, breath coming in ragged gasps. "You're not real," he growled. "Tyler died. 5 years ago. You're not him." Soft laughter answered him, no longer a child's voice, but something older, colder. The sound slithered around the outpost, probing for weaknesses, testing his resolve. "But I could be, Ethan. I could be anyone you've lost." The wind picked up outside, whistling through the trees with an almost musical quality. Within its chaotic notes, Ethan could hear whispers, dozens of overlapping voices calling his name with increasing urgency. He backed against the wall, knife held before him. "What do you want?" he demanded. The whispers ceased abruptly, leaving a silence so profound it felt like pressure against his eardrums. For several heartbeats, nothing moved. Even the wind died away as if the world itself paused to listen. Then came the reply, not in words but in a thunderous impact against the outer wall that shook the entire structure. Wood splintered. The boarded window nearest Ethan cracked, jagged lines spreading across the weathered planks. Another impact, this time against the door. The makeshift lock he'd created shuddered but held. A third blow struck the roof, showering him with dust and debris from the ceiling. Ethan's training finally gave way to primal fear. He was no longer the methodical rescuer calculating odds and planning routes. He was prey, cornered by something that had been toying with him from the beginning. Through the cracks in the damaged window, Ethan caught a glimpse of movement outside. A tall, fluid shadow slipping between the trees. Not human in its movements, but not fully animal either. Something between. Something wrong. Another shattering impact rocked the outpost, this one buckling a section of wall. Cold air rushed in through the newly formed gap, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and something else, a sharp, acrid odor that burned Ethan's nostrils. He backed toward the desk, frantically searching for anything that might serve as a weapon more substantial than his knife. His hand closed around Whitmore's logbook just as another blow struck the outpost, this one directly overhead. The impact knocked him to his knees. When he looked up, a jagged hole had opened in the ceiling, rain and wind pouring through. Against the night sky, silhouetted in the gap, something peered down at him. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ethan couldn't process what he was seeing. A shape that seemed to shift and blur at the edges, that refused to resolve into anything his mind could categorize. Only the eyes remained constant, pale, luminous orbs that fixed on him with terrible intelligence. The thing withdrew from the opening, the sound of its movement tracking across the roof. Ethan knew with sudden, awful certainty that it was headed for the door. He was no longer the hunter seeking answers in the wilderness. He was the hunted, trapped in a game whose rules he didn't understand, facing an adversary that had been playing with him from the moment he entered these mountains. The assault on the outpost ceased as suddenly as it had begun, leaving Ethan huddled in the corner, knife clutched in a white-knuckled grip. Rain pattered through the hole in the ceiling, forming a growing puddle on the wooden floor. Outside, the wind continued its mournful howl, but the terrible presence that had been trying to break in seemed to have withdrawn. For now, dawn was still hours away. Ethan knew he couldn't stay in the damaged outpost. It was no longer secure, no longer defensible. But venturing into the storm-lashed darkness with that thing hunting him was equally suicidal. His gaze fell on Whitmore's logbook, still clutched in his left hand. The answer had to be there. Whitmore had faced this before. Ethan dragged the desk beneath the least damaged section of roof and rekindled the fire in the wood stove. By its flickering light, he opened the logbook again, this time determined to read every word, to find the pattern he had missed. The early entries revealed little beyond what he'd already seen. Whitmore's growing paranoia, the strange sounds, the feeling of being watched. But as Ethan studied the handwriting itself, he noticed something he'd overlooked. The neat, orderly script of the early pages had deteriorated over time, becoming increasingly erratic. Not the change that might come from haste or stress, but something more troubling. As if two different people had been writing in the same book, or as if something had been influencing Whitmore's hand. Ethan turned to the final pages where he'd previously stopped reading. Beyond the last dated entry was what appeared to be random scribbling, but when he tilted the page toward the light, he could make out words hidden within the chaotic marks. It speaks with voices it has collected. It knows what hurts you most. Don't listen. Don't trust what you hear. And then, in larger, more jagged letters that tore through the paper in places, I let it in. God forgive me. I let it in. The final page contained a crude map, drawn with an unsteady hand. Ethan recognized the terrain, the outpost, the rocky outcropping he'd visited earlier, and a third location marked with an X. Beside it, Whitmore had written, "Where it waits." Between the lines of the journal, Ethan began to piece together a horrifying narrative. Whitmore hadn't simply disappeared or gone mad. Something had been stalking him, testing him, wearing down his defenses, just as it was now doing to Ethan. A loose photograph slipped from between the pages, a faded Polaroid showing two rangers standing before the outpost in better days. One was clearly a younger Whitmore, smiling awkwardly at the camera. The other figure stood slightly apart, its features strangely blurred as if in motion when the picture was taken, except the distortion affected only that figure, while the rest of the image remained crisp. Ethan turned the photo over, written on the back in neat script, "Carter and the New Guy, Spring '95. He studied the blurred figure more carefully. There was something wrong about the proportions. The arms too long, the head oddly shaped, and where the face should have been was nothing but a pale smudge. The radio he'd found in the woods crackled suddenly from his backpack, making him flinch violently. Ethan had brought it back, though he knew it was impossible for it to function without batteries. Yet it came to life again, static, hissing from its ancient speaker. A child's voice broke through the white noise, painfully clear. "Help me. Ethan, I'm scared. Why didn't you find me?" Tyler's voice. The same desperate plea Ethan had heard in his nightmares for 5 years. "You're not him," Ethan growled, his voice cracking. "Tyler's gone. But I'm lost, just like before." The voice continued, a perfect mimicry of the 8-year-old's frightened tone. "You said you'd find me. You promised." Ethan hurled the radio against the wall. It shattered, plastic and circuitry scattering across the floor. But the voice continued, now seeming to come from every corner of the outpost at once. "Why? Did you give up? You were so close. Just a few more minutes and you would have found me." "Stop it," Ethan shouted, pressing his hands against his ears. "You're not real." "I died waiting for you, Ethan. I was still alive when you called. Off the search." The words struck like physical blows. That had been his private, tormenting fear, that he'd abandoned the search too soon, that Tyler might still have been alive when the rescue operation was suspended due to dangerous conditions. "No," Ethan whispered, feeling something crack inside him. "We searched for 3 days. The ravine was flooded. No one could have survived." Cruel laughter echoed through the outpost. "But I did, Ethan. For hours after you left. I waited for you to come back." The voice changed, becoming deeper, older, no longer a child's but a man's. Whitmore's voice Ethan somehow knew, though he'd never heard it in life. "It uses what you fear most," the new voice warned. "It finds the cracks in your mind and widens them until you break. Don't listen. Fight it." Ethan forced himself to breathe deeply, to focus on the physical sensations anchoring him to reality. The knife in his hand, the rough wood of the floor beneath him, the heat from the wood stove against his face. The voices were tricks, manipulations. Whatever this thing was, it was trying to destabilize him, to make him vulnerable. He turned back to the map in Whitmore's journal. The X marking "Where it waits" was located perhaps a mile north of the outpost in a section of forest he hadn't yet explored. If he could make it until dawn, he might be able to investigate, to take the fight to this thing rather than cowering in fear. Ethan spent the remaining hours of darkness reinforcing what he could of the outpost's damaged structure. He fashioned a spear from a broken section of shelving, lashing his knife to the end with paracord. The work helped focus his mind, driving back the echoes of Tyler's voice that still seemed to linger in the corners of the room. When the first gray light of dawn seeped through the cracks in the boarded windows, Ethan gathered his meager supplies. The storm had lessened to a steady drizzle, but the heavy clouds promised worse to come. He needed to move quickly. He hesitated at the threshold of the outpost. For all its damage, it was still shelter, but it was also a trap, a place where that thing knew exactly where to find him. Whitmore's map in hand, Ethan set out into the sodden forest, following game trails that wound between ancient pines. The silence that had disturbed him earlier had returned. No birdsong, no rustling underbrush, nothing but the soft patter of raindrops on leaves and his own careful footsteps. The X on the map led him to a depression in the forest floor, a wide, shallow basin perhaps 50 yards across, ringed by towering spruce trees. At its center stood the remains of what might once have been a small cabin, now reduced to a crumbling stone foundation and a few rotting timbers. Ethan approached cautiously, spear at the ready. The depression seemed to catch and hold the mist, wreathing the ruins in ghostly white. As he drew closer, he noticed odd markings carved into the remains of the foundation stones, symbols he didn't recognize, arranged in concentric circles around what had once been the cabin's perimeter. Something glinted among the ruins, metal, catching what little light filtered through the clouds. Ethan knelt to examine it, a Forest Service badge, newer than Whitmore's but still tarnished by exposure. The name had been deliberately scratched out. Beneath it lay a small leather-bound notebook, its pages swollen and warped from years of damp. Ethan opened it carefully. Unlike Whitmore's official log, this was personal, a diary. The first entry was dated May 1975, 20 years before Whitmore's disappearance. May 10th, 1975. Taking this assignment was a mistake. The isolation is getting to me. And there's something wrong with these woods. The locals warned me, but I didn't listen. They say this place was sacred to the native tribes, a place where the boundary between worlds is thin, where things can cross over. May 15th, 1975. I hear it at night, circling the cabin. It whispers names I've never told anyone here. It knows things about me, about Sarah, about what happened to her. May 23rd, 1975. I tried to leave today. Hiked 6 hours due south, should have reached the main road. Somehow I ended up back here. The forest won't let me go. The entries continued, documenting a descent into terror similar to Whitmore's. The final entry was dated June 30th, 1975. It's here, inside with me now. It looks like Sarah, but it's not her. God help me, it's wearing her face, but the eyes are wrong, all wrong. If someone finds this, burn this place, salt the earth, it must not spread. Ethan closed the book with trembling hands. 20 years before Whitmore. How many others had been lured to this place? How many had fallen victim to whatever entity haunted these woods? The radio in his pack crackled to life again. Impossible, since he'd destroyed it at the outpost. Yet there it was, the same static-filled hiss. This time, no voice emerged from the white noise, just a rhythmic pattern that almost sounded like Morse code. Ethan was reaching for the radio when he noticed something at the edge of the clearing, a figure standing between the trees, partially obscured by mist. For a moment he thought it was human, a man in ranger's clothing watching him. Then the mist shifted, and Ethan saw that where the face should have been was only a blank, smooth expanse of skin. He blinked, and the figure was gone. A trick of light and shadow, perhaps, or another manifestation of the entity that seemed able to take different forms. The rain intensified suddenly, driven by a wind that shook the treetops with unexpected violence. The storm was returning, faster and more ferocious than before. Ethan needed shelter, but returning to the damaged outpost seemed more dangerous than braving the elements. The faint outline of a trail led away from the ruined cabin, winding up the slope of the basin. With no better option, Ethan followed it, fighting against the strengthening wind. The path narrowed as it climbed, hemmed in by dense brush that clawed at his clothing. Lightning split the sky, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. In that brief, brilliant illumination, Ethan saw what lay ahead, a small cave opening in the hillside, just large enough for a man to enter if he stooped. Shelter, but also a potential trap. If that thing cornered him in the cave, there would be no escape. Another lightning flash made the decision for him, revealing the same faceless figure now standing directly behind him on the trail, close enough to touch. Ethan lurched forward, in panic, scrambling toward the cave entrance. He ducked inside just as the heavens truly opened, unleashing a torrent that turned the trail behind him into a muddy river within seconds. The cave extended perhaps 20 feet into the hillside, before ending in a smooth stone wall. Previous visitors had left evidence of their presence: an old lantern, a pile of long-dead firewood, scratches on the walls that might have been tallies or desperate messages. Ethan positioned himself where he could watch the entrance while staying beyond the reach of the driving rain. His makeshift spear felt woefully inadequate against whatever was out there, but it was better than nothing. Hours passed, marked by the steady drum of rain against stone and the occasional rumble of thunder. Despite his determination to remain vigilant, exhaustion began to claim Ethan. 3 days with minimal sleep had pushed his body to its limits. He fought against it, pinching himself, reciting search protocols under his breath. Anything to stay awake. But eventually, his eyelids grew too heavy to resist. Ethan jerked awake to silence. The storm had passed while he slept, leaving an eerie quiet in its wake. His watch read 7:23 p.m. He'd been unconscious for hours. Twilight glowed at the cave entrance, the forest beyond painted in deepening shadows. Something was different. The air felt charged, expectant, and the silence wasn't complete. A soft shuffling sound came from deeper in the cave, from the section that should have been empty. Ethan raised his spear, angling his flashlight toward the sound. The beam illuminated the back wall of the cave, where he'd seen nothing but smooth stone before. Now there was an opening, a narrow fissure that hadn't been there when he entered. And emerging from that fissure, one careful step at a time, was the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Ethan backed toward the cave entrance, heart hammering against his ribs. The footsteps drew closer, accompanied now by the soft sound of breathing, not the ragged gasps of exertion, but the measured inhale and exhale of something perfectly calm, perfectly in control. His back hit the opposite wall of the cave. There was nowhere left to retreat. The footsteps stopped, leaving only that steady breathing in the darkness beyond his flashlight's reach. Then a cold breath touched the back of Ethan's neck, raising the hairs at his nape. It wasn't coming from the fissure at all, it was coming from directly behind him. He wasn't alone in the cave. He never had been. Ethan whirled, spear thrust forward in a desperate arc that cut through nothing but empty air. The cave wall behind him was solid stone. No space for anything to hide, no explanation for the breath he'd felt against his skin. He backed away, keeping the spear extended before him as he edged toward the cave entrance. Outside, the forest had fallen into the deep blue of twilight, shadows pooling beneath the trees like spilled ink. "Show yourself," Ethan shouted, voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. Only his echo answered, mocking his demand as it bounced off the stone walls. With the storm temporarily abated, he needed to return to the outpost. Despite its damaged state, it offered more protection than this exposed hillside, and he had left Whitmore's journal there, the only real clue to what was happening. The journey back was a nightmare of half-glimpsed movements and sudden silences. Twice, Ethan found himself veering off course, headed in completely wrong directions despite his certainty that he was maintaining a straight path. The forest seemed to shift around him, landmarks appearing where none had been before, familiar trees suddenly gone. It was nearly full dark by the time the outpost came into view. The damage looked worse in the dying light. The hole in the roof a black void, the partially collapsed wall a jagged wound in the structure's side. But it was still standing, still offering some measure of shelter. Ethan paused at the tree line, studying the outpost for any sign of intrusion. Something wasn't right. The door hung slightly ajar, though he was certain he had closed it when he left. And there was a soft glow coming from inside. A flickering light that could only be from the wood stove, which should have gone cold hours ago. Someone had rekindled the fire. Or something. Tightening his grip on the makeshift spear, Ethan approached cautiously. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if his body itself resisted returning to that place. He paused at the threshold, listening intently. Silence, broken only by the soft crackle of flames. Ethan pushed the door open with the butt of his spear. The interior of the outpost looked exactly as he had left it. The desk beneath the intact section of roof, his meager supplies arranged beside it. Whitmore's journal lying open on the wooden surface. The wood stove glowed with fresh flames, casting dancing shadows across the walls. He stepped inside, eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. Nothing moved. Nothing lurked. He was alone. And yet, the air felt thick, charged with a presence he couldn't see but could somehow sense, like the pressure before a thunderstorm, like eyes watching from just beyond the veil of perception. Ethan closed the door firmly behind him, wedging a broken chair beneath the handle. Then he began to work. If this thing wanted to play games, he would be ready. Using the remaining supplies from his pack and items scavenged from the outpost, Ethan constructed a series of traps, fishing lines strung across critical pathways, attached to his metal cookpot to create noise if disturbed. His remaining paracord, fashioned into tripwires, a precarious stack of metal containers balanced atop the partially open door to the storage closet. When he finished, the outpost had become a web of triggers and alarms. Nothing lethal, but enough to alert him to any movement, enough to prove that he wasn't simply imagining the intrusions. Night fell completely outside, the darkness absolute beneath the clouded sky. The repaired fire in the wood stove provided the only light, forcing Ethan to use his precious flashlight batteries sparingly. He positioned himself in the corner with the best visibility, spear across his lap, back pressed firmly against the wall. Whitmore's journal lay open beside him. Ethan had been reviewing it again, searching for any detail he might have missed, any clue that might explain what he was facing. The entries painted a grim picture, a progression from unease to terror to something approaching madness. Would that be his fate as well? Movement flickered at the edge of his vision, something passing by the damaged section of wall. Ethan snapped his flashlight in that direction, but the beam revealed only empty forest beyond the splintered boards. He was about to turn away when something shifted in the darkness, a deeper shadow within the shadow, vaguely human in shape but wrong in its proportions. Too tall, too thin, its limbs at odd angles. "I see you," Ethan whispered, focusing the beam directly on the shape. For a heartbeat, two luminous eyes reflected the light, pale, almost colorless orbs that seemed to absorb the flashlight's glow rather than reflect it. Then they were gone, the shadow melting back into the darkness beyond. One of the tripwires vibrated softly, though nothing visible had triggered it. The temperature in the outpost plummeted suddenly, Ethan's breath fogging in the frigid air, despite the fire burning merely feet away. "Ethan." The whisper seemed to come from the walls themselves, seeping through the cracks like smoke. Not Tyler's voice this time, but a chorus of voices layered over one another. Men's, women's, children's, all speaking his name in perfect unison. "What do you want?" Ethan demanded, rising to his feet, spear held ready. "What all lost things?" "Want?" the voices replied, separating now, echoing from different corners of the outpost. "To be found." "Show yourself," Ethan challenged, turning slowly to track the whispers as they circled him. "No more games." Laughter answered him, a dry, brittle sound like dead leaves rustling. "But we've only just begun to play, Ethan Vance. The question is whether you're playing to win, or merely to survive." The lantern on the desk, an old kerosene model he'd found among the outpost supplies, flared suddenly, its flame growing impossibly tall before subsiding just as quickly. In that brief, intense illumination, Ethan caught a glimpse of something standing in the far corner of the room. A figure that seemed composed of shadow and mist, its edges constantly shifting, its form never quite solidifying into anything his mind could properly comprehend. When the light stabilized, the corner was empty. But Whitmore's journal, which had been lying open beside the lantern, had moved. It now lay in the center of the desk, open to a page that had been blank before. Fresh writing covered the yellowed paper, not Whitmore's increasingly erratic scrawl, but a neat, precise hand that Ethan recognized with a chill of horror. It was his own handwriting. It finds the cracks in your mind and widens them until you break. It shows you what you fear most. It makes you doubt what's real. I am it. It is me. We are the same. Ethan backed away from the desk, bile rising in his throat. He hadn't written those words. He couldn't have. Yet there they were, in his distinctive script, the same slant to the letters, the same pressure patterns that he'd used since childhood. "This isn't real," he said aloud, voice shaking. "You're trying to make me doubt myself." "Are we?" The whispers returned, amused now. "Or are you finally seeing the truth, Ethan? How long have you been here? Really? Days? Weeks? Years?" The question struck him like a physical blow. How long had it been? His watch said 3 days since he'd entered these mountains, but time had become increasingly fluid, increasingly unreliable. Hours seemed to vanish. Night came too quickly, lasted too long. 3 days, he insisted, but doubt had taken root. His memories of the time before the outpost were becoming hazy, indistinct. Had he really been a search and rescue specialist? Had Tyler Anderson actually existed? Or was that just another trick, another manipulation? "Look at yourself, Ethan," the voices urged. "Really look." His gaze dropped to his hands, still clutching the makeshift spear. They were filthy, the nails broken and caked with dirt, the knuckles raw. But there was something else. Something he hadn't noticed before. Thin white scars crisscrossed his palms, old wounds he had no memory of receiving. "What is this?" he whispered, turning his hands over to examine the backs, finding more scars there. "What have you done to me?" "We've done nothing. You did this to yourself. Just as Carter did, just as all the others did, trying to escape, trying to wake up." One of Ethan's traps triggered suddenly, the stack of metal containers he'd balanced on the closet door crashing to the floor with a cacophony that made him flinch violently. When he looked up, the closed door was now standing open, revealing the small storage space beyond. A space that had been empty earlier, but now contained something propped against the far wall. Ethan approached cautiously, spear extended. In the dim light from the wood stove, he could make out a rectangular shape, wrapped in what appeared to be an old tarp. He prodded it with the spear shaft, then, when nothing happened, set his weapon aside and carefully pulled back the covering, a mirror. An old, full-length mirror in a tarnished metal frame, its surface cloudy with age but still reflective. Ethan stared at his reflection, barely recognizing the haggard face that looked back at him. His beard was longer than it should have been after just 3 days. At least a week's worth of growth darkened his jaw. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, which held a wild, haunted look he'd never seen in himself before. But worse than these, changes was what stood behind him in the reflection. A tall, indistinct figure, its features constantly shifting between those of a man, a woman, a child. Only the eyes remained constant, pale, empty orbs that seemed to look not at him but through him. Ethan spun around. The outpost behind him was empty. When he turned back to the mirror, his reflection was alone again, but changed. Older, with gray streaking his hair and beard, the lines around his eyes deeper, his clothes more ragged and worn. As he watched in horror, the reflection aged before his eyes, the hair whitening completely, the face becoming gaunt, the eyes sinking into hollow sockets. Ethan stumbled backward, colliding with the desk, sending Whitmore's journal crashing to the floor. The mirror, Ethan did not mimic his movement but remained standing, staring out at him with an expression of profound sadness. The reflection's lips moved, forming words Ethan couldn't hear. He found himself stepping forward again, drawn against his will, straining to understand. "What?" he whispered. "What are you trying to tell me?" The mirror, Ethan's mouth opened wider, jaw distending impossibly, stretching until the face was no longer human. From the gaping maw emerged not words but a high, keening wail that somehow penetrated the glass, filling the outpost with a sound of such profound anguish that Ethan clapped his hands over his ears. The mirror shattered explosively, shards flying across the small space. Ethan threw his arms up to protect his face, feeling glass slice into his forearms. When he lowered them, the closet was empty again. No sign of the mirror or its frame, only glittering fragments on the floor proving it had ever existed. Blood trickled down his arms from a dozen small cuts. Ethan pressed his sleeve against the worst of them, mind reeling. Was any of this real? Was he losing his grip on sanity, trapped in some kind of psychotic break? Or was this entity truly capable of warping reality around him? The whispers returned, sliding through the outpost, like cold fingers touching everything, probing for weakness. "Do you understand now, Ethan? You cannot fight what you cannot define, you cannot escape what you cannot comprehend." He retrieved his spear, backing toward the outpost door. He needed to get out, to clear his head, to find some perspective, beyond these suffocating walls. "Running again, Ethan? Like you ran from Tyler? Like you've run from every failure in your life?" "Shut up," Ethan shouted, slashing the spear through empty air. "You're not real." "Then why are you afraid?" The whispers condensed, becoming a single voice, his own voice but twisted, hollow, echoing as if spoken from the bottom of a well. Ethan reached the door, fumbling with the makeshift barricade, desperate now to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the outpost. As he pulled the chair away, a soft, knocking sound came from the other side, 3 precise taps against the wood. He froze, spear raised. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Tap, tap, tap. "Who's there?" Ethan called, voice cracking. No answer came. Just another series of taps, faster now, almost eager. Ethan backed away from the door. Whatever was out there, he wasn't going to let it in. He would wait until dawn, then make a break for it, try to find his way out of these mountains once and for all. The doorknob turned slowly, metal grinding against metal. Ethan had locked it. He knew he had. Yet the mechanism rotated, the latch, retracting with a soft click. The door remained closed for a long moment, a thin line of darkness visible around its edges. Then, with agonizing slowness, it began to swing inward, revealing the night beyond. Empty. The clearing before the sea. Outpost was empty. Ethan exhaled shakily, some small measure of relief washing through him. But as he took a step forward, intending to close and resecure the door, he noticed something odd about the way it moved. Not swinging freely as it should, but with a deliberate, controlled motion. As if someone on this side was opening it. He spun around, scanning the outpost's interior. He was alone, and yet the door continued to open, guided by an invisible hand. The whispers rose to a crescendo, no longer coming from the walls or corners but from directly behind him now, close enough that he could feel the chill of them against his neck. "Let me in, Ethan," his own voice said into his ear. "Let me in as you always do." Primal instinct overrode thought. Ethan lunged for the open doorway, abandoning his makeshift spear, driven by the desperate need to escape the presence that had somehow manifested inside the outpost with him. He burst into the night, the cold mountain air shocking his lungs as he gulped it down in ragged breaths. Behind him, laughter echoed from the outpost, his own voice distorted and hollow, following him into the darkness. Ethan ran blindly, crashing through underbrush, branches whipping against his face and arms. The rational part of his mind, the part that had once calmly directed search operations, that had mapped rescue routes through impossible terrain, screamed at him to stop, to orient himself, to think. But that voice was drowned out by the overwhelming need to put distance between himself and whatever had been in the outpost with him. The forest closed around him, trees looming like sentinels in the starless night. Clouds had swallowed the moon, leaving him in near total darkness. His flashlight beam bounced wildly ahead, illuminating fragmented glimpses of the landscape. A fallen log, a rocky outcropping, the twisted trunk of an ancient pine. Finally, lungs burning, legs trembling with exertion, Ethan collapsed against a massive tree. He forced himself to breathe deeply to slow his racing heart. Panic was the enemy now. He needed to think, to plan. The storm that had temporarily abated was gathering strength again. Wind moaned through the treetops and the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the leaves overhead. Ethan needed shelter, but the thought of returning to the outpost sent a wave of visceral fear through him. Lightning split the sky, briefly illuminating his surroundings. He was in an unfamiliar section of forest, denser than the areas he'd explored previously. The terrain sloped upward before him, rising toward what appeared to be a ridgeline. Higher ground. That was the first rule in any wilderness situation. Get to high ground, establish landmarks, determine a direction. The exposed ridge would be dangerous in a lightning storm, but Ethan would risk it to gain his bearings. He clicked off his flashlight to conserve battery and removed his knife from its sheath. Using the blade, he carved a deep X into the bark of the tree he'd been leaning against. If this thing could manipulate his perception, could make him doubt his own memories and experiences, then he needed physical anchors in reality. The climb was treacherous, the ground already turning slick with rain. Twice, Ethan lost his footing, sliding several yards back down the slope before managing to halt his descent by grabbing onto exposed roots or rocky outcroppings. Each time he marked his passage, another X carved into a tree trunk, a stack of stones arranged in an unmistakable pattern. The wind intensified as he neared the ridge, now carrying stinging pellets of sleet that abraded his exposed skin. Ethan pulled his rain jacket tighter, cursing the deteriorating weather. The storm was returning faster than he'd anticipated, driving him toward shelter he didn't want to seek. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, the accompanying thunder of physical pressure against his eardrums. In that stark illumination, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. The tree directly ahead of him bore a freshly carved X, identical to the marks he'd been leaving. "Impossible," he muttered, approaching the trunk cautiously. The cut was recent, the exposed wood still pale and unseasoned. Ethan ran his fingers over the mark, finding it identical to those he'd been carving down to the slightly deeper pressure on the left side, a quirk of his right-handed cutting technique. Another flash of lightning revealed more marked trees ahead, forming a line that led up toward the ridge. Trees he hadn't yet reached, bearing marks he couldn't have made. Unless he had been here before. Unless his memories couldn't be trusted. Ethan shook his head violently, dispelling the thought. This was another manipulation, another trick. He would not give in to doubt. He carved a new mark into the tree. Not an X this time, but an arrow pointing in the direction he intended to travel, away from the line of pre-marked trees. He forged ahead, fighting against the strengthening wind, the sleet now turning to driving snow that reduced visibility to mere feet. Every few yards, Ethan stopped to leave another arrow mark, anchoring his path in physical reality. 20 minutes later, he spotted a mark ahead. An arrow, pointing in exactly the direction he was traveling. An arrow he had not yet carved. "No," Ethan whispered, the word torn away by the wind. "This isn't real." He changed direction abruptly, veering east instead of continuing north. The storm intensified, snow swirling in disorienting patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if the weather itself were conspiring against him. After another 100 yards, Ethan carved a spiral pattern into a tree. Something distinctive. Something he was certain he hadn't used before. 5 minutes later, his flashlight beam fell upon the same spiral, carved into a tree that loomed suddenly out of the snowstorm. Ethan's composure cracked. He spun in a circle, flashlight slashing through the darkness, revealing nothing but endless trees and driving snow. He was walking in circles, or the forest itself was shifting around him, herding him like a sheep. "Ethan, help me." The voice drifted through the howling wind, distant, distorted, but unmistakably human. A woman's voice calling his name with desperate urgency. "Who's there?" he shouted back, voice swallowed by the storm. "Please, I'm hurt. I need help." The voice seemed to come from somewhere ahead and to his right. Ethan hesitated. This could be another trap, another manipulation. But what if it wasn't? What if someone else was lost in the storm? Someone who genuinely needed help? That had always been his weakness, the inability to ignore a call for help, even when every instinct warned of danger. "Ethan, I can see your light. Please." He moved cautiously toward the voice, flashlight beam probing the swirling snow. The ground beneath his feet changed, becoming rockier, less stable. The trees thinned out, suggesting he was approaching some kind of clearing or drop-off. "I'm here. Just a little closer." One more step and Ethan's lead foot met empty air. He lurched backward, nearly losing his balance, heart hammering in his chest. The flashlight beam revealed what he had almost walked into, a sheer drop of at least 30 feet, ending in jagged rocks below. The voice had nearly led him to his death. "Why did you stop, Ethan? I need you. Come closer." The tone had changed. Still feminine, still pleading, but with an undercurrent of something else now, something hungry. "You're not real," Ethan growled, backing away from the precipice. "None of this is real." Laughter echoed through the storm, no longer pretending to be human, no longer disguising its malevolent nature. "Real enough to kill you, Ethan Vance, real enough to add your voice to our collection, just like the others, just like Whitmore." Ethan turned and ran, no longer caring about direction, focused only on putting distance between himself and that terrible voice. The storm seemed to fight him every step of the way, wind pushing against him like a physical barrier, snow blinding him, the ground itself becoming treacherous beneath his feet. He lost track of time, of distance, of everything except the burning in his lungs and the leaden weight of his legs as he forged blindly ahead. When his strength finally gave out, Ethan collapsed against yet another tree, gasping for breath, muscles trembling with exhaustion. The flashlight flickered once, twice, then died, leaving him in absolute darkness. Ethan fumbled for the spare batteries in his jacket pocket, found them, and with shaking hands managed to replace the dead ones. The beam sputtered back to life, weaker than before but still functional. What it illuminated made his blood run cold. The ranger outpost stood directly ahead, not 50 yards away, its damaged silhouette unmistakable against the storm-dark sky. "No," Ethan whispered, the word a prayer and a denial in one. "I ran for miles. I couldn't have circled back." And yet there it was, the same outpost he'd fled from, somehow directly in his path despite what should have been impossible. The door hung open, spilling warm golden light into the snowy clearing, an invitation and a trap combined. Ethan sagged against the tree, mind reeling. He was caught in something beyond his understanding, a loop, a maze, a distortion of reality itself. No matter how far or fast he ran, he would end up back here, back at this nexus of whatever malevolent force had ensnared him. The entity's words echoed in his memory. Just like the others, just like Whitmore. Others had been trapped here before him. Others had tried to escape, had run until their strength gave out, only to find themselves right back where they started. How many had been added to that chorus of voices he'd heard? How many had been absorbed by whatever dwelled in these mountains? Ethan closed his eyes, fighting against despair. He'd spent his entire rescue career finding paths where none seemed to exist, locating people who'd vanished into wilderness that swallowed the unprepared whole. There had to be a way out of this trap. Unless the trap wasn't the outpost at all. Unless the true trap was his own refusal to confront what waited inside. The snowstorm intensified, driving him toward the only available shelter. With each gust of frigid wind, the warm light from the outpost's open door seemed more appealing, more necessary. Survival demanded he seek shelter soon, or risk hypothermia. Ethan pushed away from the tree, staggering toward the outpost with leaden steps. He had no illusions now. Whatever waited inside was no random entity, no simple predator. It had been testing him, studying him, learning his weaknesses and fears. The way it mimicked voices, the way it knew exactly what would break him down psychologically, this was calculated, deliberate torture. At the threshold, he hesitated one final time. Behind him, the storm raged, promising a slow, cold death. Before him, the warm interior of the outpost offered survival, but at what cost? From inside came the soft sound of pages turning. Whitmore's journal, being read by unseen hands. This was never about running. This was about facing what waited. About breaking the cycle that had claimed Whitmore and who knew how many others before him. Ethan stepped through the doorway, back into the outpost that had become both refuge and prison. The door swung shut behind him of its own accord, the latch clicking with quiet finality. Inside, everything looked exactly as he had left it. The my desk with the lantern, the wood stove still burning, his meager possessions scattered in his panicked flight. But the atmosphere had changed. The air felt heavier, charged with a presence that was no longer hiding, no longer playing games. Whitmore's journal lay open on the desk, a pen placed neatly beside it, waiting. "I understand now," Ethan said to the empty room, knowing it wasn't empty at all. "This isn't about escape. It never was." The whispers returned, sliding through the cracks in the walls, seeping from the floorboards, drifting down from the damaged ceiling. A chorus of voices layered over one another, speaking just out of sync. "Then what is it about, Ethan Vance? Tell us what you've learned." He moved to the desk, staring down at the open journal. The page contained a single line in his own handwriting, a line he had no memory of writing. "The only way out is through." "It's about choice," Ethan said, picking up the pen. "You've been hurting me back here because this is where it happens. This is where I make my decision." The whispers intensified, excited now, anticipatory. "And what decision is that, Ethan?" He looked up from the journal, scanning the outpost. In the corner farthest from the fire, the darkness seemed deeper, more concentrated, a pool of shadow that didn't behave as shadow should, that moved, slightly against the air currents that watched him with an intelligence he could feel if not see. "Whether to keep running," Ethan said quietly, "or to face the truth inside." The shadow in the corner expanded slightly, edges rippling like dark water disturbed by a stone. Within its depths, points of pale light appeared, eyes, dozens of them, opening to fix upon him with hungry intensity. A final choice loomed before Ethan, to flee once more into the storm, to continue the cycle of futile escape attempts until exhaustion and exposure claimed him, or to confront whatever waited in that corner, to face the entity that had claimed so many before him, to face the truth of what the mountains had awakened, in them and in himself. Ethan stood motionless before the desk, pen clutched in his hand, aware of the shadow-gathering substance in the corner. The whispering had ceased, replaced by an expectant silence that pressed against his eardrums like deep water. "Show yourself," he said, voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "No more games, no more tricks." The shadow rippled, contracting in on itself, condensing into a more defined shape. Not fully human, not fully anything recognizable, a form that existed in the spaces between categories, in the blind spots of perception. "But the games are what sustain us, Ethan," it replied, its voice no longer a chorus but a single tone, neither male nor female, neither young nor old. The fear, the doubt, the slow erosion of certainty until nothing remains but the question, what is real? "I know what's real," Ethan said, though the words rang hollow even to his own ears. How much of what he'd experienced in these mountains had been reality, and how much manipulation? The shadow seemed to sense his uncertainty, expanding slightly as if feeding on it. "Do you? Tell us then, Ethan Vance. Tell us who you really are." The question struck deeper than it should have. Ethan opened his mouth to answer, to assert his identity, former search and rescue specialist survivor, a man who had come to these mountains seeking solitude, but the words died on his lips. Were those memories real? Or were they constructs, implanted by this entity to create the very vulnerabilities it had been exploiting? The shadow glided closer, leaving the corner, but staying just beyond the circle of lantern light. We've had so many visitors over the centuries, it continued, each bringing their own delicious fears, their own unique flavors of doubt. But you're special, Ethan. Your guilt runs so deep, so rich. The child you failed, the life you abandoned, the endless running. Ethan's gaze dropped to Whitmore's journal, still open on the desk. New text had appeared on the page, though the pen in his hand remained unused. He thinks he came here 3 days ago. He believes he was once search and rescue. He remembers a child named Tyler who died on his watch. But memories are such fragile things, so easily altered, so easily fed upon. What are you saying? Ethan whispered, a cold dread spreading through his chest. Check the last pages, Ethan, the ones you haven't read yet. With trembling fingers, Ethan flipped to the final pages of the journal. What he found there stole the breath from his lungs. Entries dated 5 years earlier, in his own handwriting. May 15, 2020, found this old outpost while searching for the Anderson boy. Storm forced me to take shelter. Something feels wrong about this place. May 16, 2020, no radio contact. Storm isn't letting up. Thought I heard Tyler calling for me last night, but that's impossible. The ravine was too deep, the water too fast. No one could have survived that fall. May 17th, 2020. Someone's been in here with me. My supplies have been moved. Found footprints that aren't mine. Going to set traps tonight to catch whoever it is. The entries continued, documenting a descent into paranoia and fear identical to what Ethan had experienced over the past 3 days. The final dated entry was from May 23, 2020, 5 years ago. I understand now. It's not human. Whatever's out there. It's something older, something that was here long before the forests grew. It feeds on fear, on doubt, on guilt, and I've given it so much to feast on. My failure to find Tyler, my certainty that I gave up too soon. The voice in the storm isn't Tyler, it's this thing using my guilt against me. I won't give it what it wants, I won't. The entry ended abruptly, the final words trailing off as if the writer had been interrupted. The next page contained only 5 words, written in a shaky, desperate hand. It's in here with me. Ethan staggered backward, the journal falling from his nerveless fingers. This is a trick, he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. I've never been here before. I would remember. The shadow laughed, the sound like ice cracking. Would you? When the mind breaks, Ethan, it protects itself. It creates new narratives, new histories, anything to avoid facing the truth. What truth? Ethan demanded, his composure crumbling. What are you talking about? That you never left these mountains. That you've been here for 5 years, trapped in a loop of your own making, running the same paths, finding the same clues, coming to the same revelations, only to forget and begin again. The words hit Ethan like physical blows. His knees buckled and he caught himself against the desk to keep from falling. It couldn't be true. He had a life before these mountains, memories of the years since Tyler's death. He'd quit search and rescue, had moved to a cabin on the outskirts of Bellingham, had lived in isolation, but not forgotten time. Hadn't he? And yet, the scars on his hands that he couldn't explain, the beard that had grown too long for just 3 days, the way the forest seemed to shift around him, leading him always back to the outpost. How? He whispered. How is this possible? The shadow drifted, closer now at the edge of the lantern's light, its form becoming more defined. Ethan could make out limbs, a torso, the suggestion of a head, but constantly shifting as if multiple forms were struggling to emerge from the same space. The gateway opened long ago when the first people came to these mountains. They knew better than to build here to stay here, but then came others with their outposts and cabins, metal and fire to drive back the old things. We were displeased. As the entity spoke, the outpost seemed to fade around the edges, becoming transparent in places. Through the walls, Ethan glimpsed not the storm-lashed forest, but other scenes, the same outpost in different seasons, in different states of repair. The same desk where he now stood, but with different objects upon it. The same wood stove, tended by different hands. Hands that, he realized with dawning horror, were sometimes his own. Time is thin here, the shadow continued. Reality bends. Those who become trapped cycle through again and again, each loop slightly different, each revelation leading to the same end. Which is what? Ethan asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. Sustenance, the shadow replied simply. Fear is the finest food, guilt the sweetest wine. You've nourished us well, Ethan Vance. You and Carter Whitmore and all the others who came before, who carried their burdens into these mountains and never truly left. The floor beneath Ethan's feet groaned suddenly, a deep structural sound that didn't come from the aging outpost but from somewhere beneath it. He looked down just as the boards began to splinter, revealing not the expected soil and stone foundation, but a darkness deeper than night. He leaped back, narrowly avoiding the widening hole. What had appeared to be breaking floorboards was actually a hidden hatch, now swinging open to reveal a black void below. A cold draft wafted up from the opening, carrying the unmistakable smell of decay. What is this? Ethan demanded, the hairs on his arms rising. What's down there? The shadow glided to the edge of the hatch, peering down into the darkness with its many pale eyes. The beginning, it answered cryptically, and the end. The place where all cycles converge, where all who are lost eventually find their way. From the opening came sounds, movement in the darkness, the soft shuffling of what might have been footsteps, the quiet rasp of breathing. Not one creature, but many, moving just beyond the range of perception. They're waiting for you, Ethan, as they've been waiting all along. A voice drifted up from the void, a child's voice achingly familiar. You left me, Ethan. Tyler's voice, the same accusation that had haunted his nightmares for 5 years. You knew I was still alive, you felt it, but you gave up anyway. Ethan sank to his knees beside the hatch, tears streaming down his face. I'm sorry, he whispered. We searched for days. The conditions were impossible. I had to make the call. You didn't have to, the voice replied, closer now as if Tyler were just below the opening. You chose to. You chose to leave me there, alone in the dark. No. Ethan sobbed, the weight of his guilt threatening to crush him. I would never. I did everything I could. The shadow flowed around him, enveloping him in its cold embrace. Did you? Or did you secretly know he might still be alive and choose the easier path, the safer path? Did you abandon your responsibility because it was too painful to face the possibility of failure? The question sliced through Ethan's defenses, laying bare the doubts that had festered within him since that terrible day. Had he called off the search too soon? Had he known somehow that Tyler might still be alive but couldn't bear to confront that possibility? I didn't know, Ethan whispered, but the conviction that had once bolstered those words had eroded, leaving only uncertainty, movement in the darkness below. Something was ascending toward the hatch opening, a small, pale hand gripping the edge. Then why do you punish yourself, Ethan? Why 5 years of isolation? Why the nightmares? Why the endless guilt? People who truly believe they did everything possible don't torture themselves as you have. The hand on the edge of the hatch was joined by another, small, childlike hands, white as bone, fingers unnaturally elongated. Because deep down, You know the truth. You left me to die, Ethan. And part of you died with me in that ravine. The hands pulled upward, revealing thin arms, then narrow shoulders. A head began to emerge from the darkness, the shape of a child's head. But wrong somehow. The proportions distorted, the features indistinct except for the eyes. Large, pale, orbs that fixed on Ethan with terrible accusation. No! Ethan scrambled backward, away from the thing emerging from the hatch. Not Tyler, not a child at all, but something wearing the approximation of a child's form. Something ancient and hungry that had latched onto his guilt like a parasite. You're not him. Tyler died in that ravine. I couldn't have saved him no matter how long we searched. The admission tore from his throat, raw and painful. The truth he'd been unable to accept for 5 years. The search had been called off because survival had been impossible, not because Ethan had failed or given up too soon. Tyler had died on impact. There had been nothing to find but a body, and even that had been swept away by the floodwaters. The creature halfway emerged from the hatch paused, its false form flickering like a faulty projection. No. It hissed, voice no longer a child's, but something ancient and malevolent. You were to blame. You failed him. Failed them all. Ethan rose to his feet, a strange clarity washing over him. I didn't fail Tyler. I failed myself by refusing to accept what happened, by letting guilt consume me when I should have honored his memory by continuing to help others. The shadow around him recoiled slightly, the edges of its form becoming less distinct. You belong to us now, it insisted, though its voice had lost some of its confidence. Like Whitmore, like all the others. You've been here too long, given too much of yourself to ever leave. Have I? Ethan challenged, moving toward Whitmore's journal, still lying open on the floor where he'd dropped it. Or is that just another manipulation? Another lie to keep me trapped in this cycle? He picked up the journal, turning to the entries allegedly written in his own hand 5 years earlier. Looking at them now, with newfound clarity, he could see subtle inconsistencies, strokes that didn't quite match his usual handwriting, phrases he would never use. This isn't real, he said, certainty growing within him. None of it is. Not the journal entries, not the voice in the dark. You've been feeding me exactly what I feared most, that I was somehow responsible for Tyler's death that I gave up too soon. You found that guilt and amplified it, twisted it, used it to trap me here. The creature in the hatch opening let out a screech of rage, its borrowed form dissolving into something far less human, far more primal. Multiple limbs thrashed against the edges of the opening as it struggled to pull itself up into the outpost. You cannot leave, the shadow surrounding Ethan insisted, pressing in on him from all sides, its chill seeping into his bones. The storm will not allow it. The forest will not allow it. You will wander in circles until exhaustion claims you, and then you will join us, as all lost things do. I'm not lost, Ethan said, conviction strengthening his voice. And I never was. I knew exactly what I was doing when I came to these mountains 3 days ago. I was running from a past I couldn't change instead of building a future I could. He reached for the lantern on the desk, holding it high. The shadow retreated from its light, hissing in displeasure. The storm will kill you, it warned. The cold, the exposure, you have no supplies, no food, the outpost is your only shelter. Better to die free than live trapped, Ethan replied, moving toward the door, lantern extended before him like a shield. But I don't intend to die. Not here. Not now. The creature in the hatch had pulled itself halfway out now, revealing a grotesque form that borrowed elements from human, animal, and something altogether alien. It fixed its pale eyes on Ethan, mouth opening to reveal rows of needle-like teeth. You'll never find your way out, it gurgled, voice bubbling as if spoken through liquid. The forest is ours. The mountains are ours. You are ours. We'll see about that, Ethan said, reaching for the door handle. Behind him, the creature lunged impossibly fast. Ethan spun, swinging the lantern in a desperate arc. The glass shattered against the thing's misshapen head, kerosene splashing across its pale flesh. Flames erupted instantly, enveloping the creature in a roar of fire. Its scream shook the outpost to its foundations, a sound of such primal rage and pain that Ethan clapped his hands over his ears. The shadow surrounding him roiled and churned in apparent agony, synchronized with the burning entity. Ethan seized his opportunity, yanking the door open and plunging into the night. Behind him, the outpost filled with unearthly wailing, the windows glowing with unnatural light as the fire spread. He ran, not looking back, following a straight line away from the burning structure. The storm had ceased, the air unnaturally still, the sky above cleared to reveal a bowl of stars. The absolute silence pressed against his ears, more ominous than the howling wind had been. The sound of the hatch slamming shut echoed through the forest, followed by a concussive wave that nearly knocked Ethan off his feet. When he regained his balance and turned to look back, the outpost was gone. Not burning, not destroyed, but simply absent, as if it had never existed at all. In the sudden, absolute silence of the mountain night, Ethan stood alone, wondering if he had truly escaped, or if this too was just another layer of the nightmare. Stars wheeled overhead in the suddenly clear sky, casting pale silver light across the forest. Where the ranger outpost had stood moments before, Ethan now faced nothing but an empty clearing. Unmarked snow, undisturbed trees, no sign that any structure had ever existed there. He stood motionless, breath-forming clouds in the frigid air, waiting for some new trick, some fresh horror to emerge from the shadows. But the forest remained silent, the unnatural stillness persisting as if the entire mountain held its breath. "Is this real?" Ethan whispered, the words crystallizing before him. Was he truly free, or had he simply moved deeper into the labyrinth? The cold began to penetrate his awareness, reminding him that whether this was reality or another layer of manipulation, he needed to move or risk hypothermia. Dawn couldn't be far off. The eastern sky showed the faintest lightning behind the jagged peaks. Ethan took a tentative step forward, half expecting the ground to shift beneath him or the clearing to transform. When nothing changed, he took another step and another, gradually building confidence in the solidity of the world around him. A line of footprints appeared in the snow ahead, a single set leading away from the clearing and into the trees. Not his own tracks, which had been obliterated by the fresh snowfall, but new prints that appeared to have been made recently. Ethan approached them cautiously. The tracks were human-sized, with a distinctive pattern in the sole that triggered a memory he couldn't quite place. They led in a straight line away from where the outpost had been, heading roughly southeast, downslope toward the valley and, presumably, civilization. He had no map, no compass, no supplies beyond what he carried in his pockets. The footprints offered a path possibly toward safety, but after everything he'd experienced, Ethan hesitated to follow any trail he hadn't made himself. The pre-dawn light strengthened, bringing definition to the landscape. As Ethan studied the footprints, more carefully he noticed something odd. They didn't sink into the snow as they should. They appeared more like impressions pressed from below, as if someone had walked underneath the snow and pushed upward. Even as he watched, the nearest footprint began to fill with a dark liquid that wasn't melted snow or mud. It welled up from within the impression, black and viscous in the faint light. Ethan backed away, pulse quickening. This was another trap, another manipulation. He turned, intending to find his own path down the mountain, and froze. Behind him, impossibly, stood Tyler Anderson. Not the twisted, monstrous approximation that had emerged from the hatch, but Tyler as Ethan remembered him. 8 years, old dark hair falling across his forehead, wearing the red jacket he'd disappeared in. The boy's face was solemn, his eyes reflecting a wisdom far beyond his years. "You're not real," Ethan said, voice breaking. "You can't be." Tyler didn't respond. He simply stood there, watching Ethan with an unblinking gaze, snow falling through his form as if he were made of nothing more substantial than light and memory. "I'm sorry," Ethan continued, tears threatening. "I wish I could have found you in time. I wish I could have brought you home." The boy raised his hand, pointing to something behind Ethan. Then, like fog dispersing in sunlight, Tyler's form dissolved, particles scattering on the gentle breeze that had begun to stir. Ethan turned to see what the boy had been pointing at. In the strengthening dawn light, a new path had become visible, not marked by footprints but by a subtle parting of underbrush, a natural corridor through the trees that he hadn't noticed before. He hesitated, then made his decision. Whatever game was being played, whatever forces were at work in these mountains, he would not remain passive. He would choose his own path, even if it led to destruction. Ethan followed the new trail, moving cautiously but deliberately, marking his passage by breaking small branches or scratching bark. The forest began to thin as he descended, the towering pines giving way to younger growth, suggesting he was approaching the timberline. The sun crested the eastern peaks, spilling golden light across the snow-covered landscape. In that illumination, Ethan spotted something colorful ahead, a flash of bright orange that didn't belong among the winter whites and greens. He approached to find a small camp nestled in a protected hollow, 3 tents arranged around a fire pit, now cold and filled with snow. The orange he'd seen came from a search and rescue jacket hung on a branch, crusted with ice crystals that suggested it had been abandoned for at least a day. Ethan moved through the camp with growing confusion. This was a professional search operation, equipment carefully arranged, supplies properly secured against wildlife. But who would be searching these remote mountains in the middle of winter? A laminated map was pinned to a nearby tree, partially covered with snow. Ethan brushed it clear, revealing a detailed topographical rendering of the area with a search grid marked in red. His blood ran cold as he read the notation at the bottom. Search Grid 7B. Vance, Ethan, last known location. Beside the map hung a missing person bulletin with his own face staring back at him. The date listed was 3 days earlier, the day he'd entered the mountains. "That's not possible," Ethan whispered. "I never reported my route. No one knew where I was going." He examined the camp more carefully, looking for signs of its occupants. A logbook sealed in a weatherproof case lay on a folding table, its pages fluttering in the morning breeze. Ethan opened it with trembling hands. Day 1. Grid search of Sectors 5 through 7 complete. No sign of subject. Weather deteriorating. Forecast suggests major system moving in within 24 hours. Day 2. Search suspended due to dangerous conditions. Storm intensity exceeding predictions. Base camp reporting loss of contact with all teams. Will attempt to re-establish communication when conditions permit. Day 3. Decision made to evacuate. Storm showing no signs of abating. Team leader overruled objections. No point risking more lives when survival chances for subject are now minimal. Will report coordinates for recovery. Operation when weather clears. God forgive us for leaving him out here. The final entry was dated the previous afternoon, while Ethan had been trapped in the outpost, fighting for his life and sanity against the entity in the darkness. He sank onto a snow-covered log, mind reeling. Had there truly been a search party looking for him? Had he been officially missing? The last thing he clearly remembered before entering these mountains was preparing his gear in his cabin, planning a solitary trek to what? The memories slipped away like water through cupped hands. Why had he come here? For solitude, yes, but there had been something more, something he'd been seeking, or perhaps running from. A sound pulled him from his thoughts, the soft crunch of snow beneath a boot. Ethan looked up, half expecting to see the entity in some new guise. Instead, he found himself staring at a ranger in official Forest Service uniform, regarding him with a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Vance?" the ranger called, squinting as if not trusting his eyes. "Ethan Vance?" Ethan stood slowly, uncertain whether this was reality or another trick. "Yes," he answered cautiously. "I'm Ethan Vance." The ranger's expression transformed from disbelief to relief. He pressed a button on his radio. "Base, this is Daniels. You're not going to believe this, but I've found him. Vance is alive. I repeat, Ethan Vance is alive and appearing uninjured. Over." The radio squawked with a burst of excited voices. The ranger approached, removing his glove to offer his hand. "Scott Daniels, we've had teams looking for you for 3 days. How the hell did you survive that storm?" Ethan shook the offered hand, the solid warmth of it more convincing than anything else that this might actually be real. "I found shelter," he said simply, reluctant to mention the outpost that no longer existed. "Must have been good shelter," Daniels remarked, looking Ethan over with professional assessment. "That was the worst storm system we've recorded in these mountains in 20 years. We had to pull our teams out yesterday. Conditions were too dangerous to continue. I just came back to pack up the last of the equipment." "How did you know I was missing?" Ethan asked, the question that had been burning in his mind. "I didn't file a route plan. No one knew where I was going." Daniels gave him an odd look. "Your emergency contact reported you missing when you didn't check in. You always check in," she said. "Every night without fail, especially when you're in the backcountry." "Emergency contact?" Ethan repeated, confusion evident in his voice. "Sarah," Daniel said, concern creeping into his expression. "Sarah Mercer? Your fiancée?" The name hit Ethan like a physical blow. Sarah. How could he have forgotten Sarah? Images flooded his mind. A woman with auburn hair and laughing eyes. A cabin they shared on the outskirts of town. Plans for a spring wedding. The life he'd built after leaving search and rescue. "Yes," he said weakly. "Sarah. Of course." Daniels was watching him closely now. Professional concern replacing his earlier relief. "You might be suffering from hypothermia or exposure. Let's get you back to base camp. Medical team can check you over." As they prepared to leave, Ethan glanced back up the slope, toward where the ranger outpost had stood. In the clear morning light, he could see no trace of it, no indication that anything unusual had ever happened there. Just endless forest, blanketed in pristine snow. "Did you ever find any structures up there?" Ethan asked as they began their descent. "Cabins, outposts, anything like that?" Daniel shook his head. "That area's been wilderness for decades. No permanent structures on record since the old fire tower was demolished in the 60s. "Why?" "Just curious," Ethan replied, unwilling to say more. They hiked in silence for a time, the forest gradually becoming less threatening, more ordinary in the growing daylight. Ethan struggled to reconcile the past 3 days with the world he was apparently returning to. A world where he had a fiancée, a future, a life that seemed both familiar and strangely foreign. Had it all been hallucination? Some elaborate delusion brought on by exposure and isolation? The entity in the outpost, the voices in the storm, Whitmore's journal, had those been nothing more than his mind fracturing under extreme conditions? As they rounded a bend in the trail, Ethan glanced back one final time. For just an instant, he thought he saw something at the edge of the tree line, a tall, indistinct figure watching their departure. But when he blinked, it was gone, leaving him uncertain whether it had been there at all. The trek down the mountain passed in a blur of exhaustion and confusion. Eventually, they reached a Forest Service road where vehicles waited. Medical personnel immediately surrounded Ethan, checking his vitals, wrapping him in thermal blankets, asking questions he answered mechanically. "Remarkable condition," he overheard one medic saying to another. 3 days in those conditions. He should be severely hypothermic at minimum, possibly frostbitten. But aside from mild dehydration and exhaustion, he's fine. Maybe he really did find good shelter, the other replied with a shrug. Ethan closed his eyes, letting their voices wash over him. Sarah was on her way, they told him. She'd be at the ranger station within the hour. He should rest until then. As they drove away from the mountains, Ethan watched the peaks recede in the distance, their jagged silhouettes stark against the winter sky. Had he escaped something ancient and malevolent? Or had he simply been lucky, finding shelter from a storm that had nearly claimed his life? The ranger station was a flurry of activity when they arrived. Reports being filed, equipment being stowed, the search officially being called off now that the subject had been located. Ethan sat apart from it all, sipping hot coffee that tasted like the most wonderful thing he'd ever experienced. A bulletin board across the room caught his attention, specifically a faded missing persons poster partially hidden behind newer notices. Ethan approached it, drawn by a sense of déjà vu. The poster was weathered, its edges curling, suggesting it had been there for years. The face staring back at him was that of Ranger Carter Whitmore, listed as missing since June 30th, 1995. Below it, a handwritten note had been added in fading ink. Case remains open. Last known location, Northwest Ridge, Grid 7B. The exact area where Ethan had found the outpost. The outpost that, according to Ranger Daniels, had never existed. The station door burst open, admitting a gust of cold air and a woman with wind-blown auburn hair. "Ethan," she cried, scanning the room before her gaze locked on him. Sarah. It really was her, just as he remembered. The slight crook in her smile, the constellation of freckles across her nose, the intensity of her green eyes. Emotions Ethan had forgotten he could feel surged through him as she crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered against his neck, voice thick with tears. "When they called off the search yesterday, I thought—" "I'm here," Ethan said, holding her tightly, anchoring himself in her solidity, in her realness. "I'm okay." Sarah pulled back to study his face, her expression transitioning from relief to concern. "You look different. What happened out there, Ethan?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. How could he possibly explain? What parts of his experience would sound like the ravings of a man driven to hallucination by exposure and isolation? What parts might contain some kernel of truth? "I got lost," he said finally, "in more ways than one, but I found my way back." Sarah seemed to sense there was more to the story, but she didn't press. "Let's go home," she said instead. "You need rest. Everything else can wait." As they stepped outside into the winter afternoon, Ethan paused to look back at the mountains one last time. They seemed smaller from here, less imposing, their secrets safely hidden behind walls of stone and forest. "You know," Sarah said, following his gaze, "the local tribes have stories about those peaks. They say there are places up there where the boundary between worlds grows thin, where things can cross over from one reality to another." Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "What kinds of things?" Sarah shrugged. "Spirits. Entities. The stories aren't specific. Just that these beings feed on fear and doubt, trapping travelers in cycles of confusion until they can no longer tell what's real." "Do the stories say how to escape?" Ethan asked quietly. "By facing the truth," Sarah replied. "By confronting what you fear most and recognizing it for what it is, just another facet of yourself." Ethan turned to stare at her, unease prickling along his spine. "How do you know that?" Sarah blinked, momentarily confused. "The Rangers were talking about it yesterday, when the search was called off. Local folklore. I thought it was interesting." She squeezed his hand. "Are you sure you're okay?" "I'm fine," Ethan assured her, pushing aside his suspicion. He was seeing shadows where none existed, hearing meaning in innocent comments. The mountains had affected him more than he wanted to admit. They drove away from the ranger station, heading toward home and normalcy. As the road wound down through pine-covered foothills, Ethan felt a weight lifting from his shoulders with each mile that passed. Whatever had happened in those mountains, hallucination or supernatural encounter, it was behind him now. That night, in the safety of their cabin, Ethan dreamed of the outpost. In the dream, he stood outside its weathered walls, watching, as countless figures moved in and out through its door, men and women from different eras, all with the same haunted expression. Among them was Ranger Whitmore, who paused to look directly at Ethan. "It's never truly over," Whitmore said, his voice carrying the same hollow quality Ethan remembered from the entity's manifestations. "The cycle continues. The hunger remains." Ethan woke with a start, heart racing. Beside him, Sarah slept peacefully, her breathing deep and even. Outside, snow had begun to fall, large, lazy flakes drifting past the window in the light of a full moon. As he watched the gentle snowfall, Ethan caught a movement at the edge of the trees surrounding their cabin. A tall, indistinct figure standing motionless, watching. When he blinked, it was gone. Just a trick of moonlight and shadow, he told himself. Nothing more. Yet as he lay back down, pulling the blankets tight around him, the whisper came. Not from outside, but seemingly from within his own mind. "See you soon, Ethan Vance." He fell asleep eventually, the words echoing in his consciousness. And as dreams claimed him once more, he could not be certain whether he had truly escaped the mountains, or whether this apparent return to normalcy was simply another layer of the entity's elaborate game, another cycle in an endless loop, another path leading inevitably back to the outpost that waited, patient and hungry, for his return. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, it would mean a lot.